Today I have a story for you that's absolutely terrifying. It took place not too far away from another encounter that I shared here on the channel that happened back in 2009. I would personally find this story terrifying no matter where it happened, but I find it even more terrifying given the fact that I just spent a week out in this area camping with my family. But before we get to today's encounter, if you've had an encounter that you'd like to have shared on the channel, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And if you're new to the channel or you're a return viewer, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. On September long weekend of 2009, relatively newlyweds Carly and Brett set off on their honeymoon out in the Whiteshell Provincial Park located in eastern Manitoba. Brett and Carly were not your average couple. They were very outdoorsy. They both grew up hunting, fishing, kayaking, backcountry camping. And about a year before, they had actually met kayaking out at Grand Beach, which is located at the southeastern tip of Lake Winnipeg. It's one of Canada's top premier beaches. It's got white sand. It's just absolutely beautiful. As soon as they met, they instantly fell in love. So when they got married in July of 2009, they spent the entire rest of the summer trying to figure out what they were going to do for their honeymoon. They decided that they did not want to go on any special trip. They did not want to go out anywhere tropical. They did not want to go to Vegas or anything like that. They decided that they would spend their honeymoon doing what they love to do the most, and that was kayaking. And being the true Manitobans that they were, they knew that the best place to do a kayaking trip like this was along the Whiteshell River system out in the Whiteshell Provincial Park. This particular kayaking route spans about 140 to 160 kilometers, depending which route you take. And what makes this particular route so unique is not the fact that it runs across multiple lakes and the scenery is just absolutely breathtaking. It's the fact that the first three lakes, you do not have to portage. There's actually these tunnels that have been blasted through the rock, which is part of the Canadian Shield, that were blasted back in the days of logging and gold mining in that area. And to get from one lake to the other, you just simply go through these tunnels. The water flows through them pretty quick. And it's just absolutely breathtaking when you go through these tunnels. It's an incredibly unique experience. I personally have done this particular system several times myself, and it's one of my favorite places to go here in Manitoba. So on the September long weekend of 2009, they loaded up their vehicle. They made the drive from Winnipeg out to the Whiteshell Provincial Park, so it's about an hour and 45 minutes. They arrived at Caddy Lake, which is the start of this trip. Once they got to Caddy Lake, they made their way towards the boat launch. They parked in this small little parking lot right alongside the boat launch, unloaded all of their gear, loaded up their kayaks, and then they started making their way down this small creek that runs out into Caddy Lake. Once they made their way off that small creek and now they were on the lake, they moved their kayaks side by side and they spent the next hour heading west towards that first tunnel. The entire time they just basically spent talking and just taking in the scenery, enjoying being out on the water and enjoying each other's company. After about an hour, they noticed up ahead on the left-hand side this large rock that comes down into the lake, and right at the edge of that rock, they could see this large triangular sign, which indicated that was the first tunnel into South Cross Lake. As they approached the tunnel, they could feel the current in the lake starting to pick up, and when they were about 20 yards from the tunnel, they slowly moved their kayaks into single file. Brett was in the lead, Carly was behind them. As they made their way into the tunnel, they could really feel the pull of the current against their kayaks. And even though this tunnel is only about 150-200 yards long, they had to periodically use their paddles to push off the sides of this tunnel just because the current's moving so fast and these rocks inside the tunnel are so sharp, they did not want to risk damaging their kayak or even worse, capsizing in the middle of this tunnel. After a couple minutes, they could see the light up ahead leading into South Cross Lake, and as they made their way through that last portion of the tunnel, the current picks up even more. So as they come out of the tunnel, they've really felt the push of this current against the kayak, kind of just shooting them out into South Cross Lake. Once they made their way onto the lake, they turned and they started heading northwest towards the far side of this lake. Now, South Cross Lake is not very wide, it's not incredibly deep, but it's super long. And at the very far northwestern side of this lake, there's a channel that runs for about 2.5 kilometers that just kind of makes its way and weaves through the rocks. It's full of weeds on both sides of this. It reminds me a lot of stuff you would see like out of the Everglades and stuff like that. Like it's a very narrow strip of water just completely surrounded by super tall weeds. So once they got to that portion of South Cross, they again up ahead they could see another one of those triangular signs indicating the next tunnel which leads into North Cross Lake. Now this second tunnel is completely different than the first tunnel. So as they approached it, they were looking and they could tell that this tunnel did not have a whole lot of head clearance. The water was fairly high this year. So they kind of hung out outside of this tunnel debating if they should even attempt to go through it or not. This tunnel is a lot lower than the first one. So they were very hesitant if they wanted to attempt to do this because when they went through that first tunnel, they realized that the water was a little bit high this year. After talking for a few minutes, Brett decided he was going to move just a little bit closer towards this tunnel to see if they would be able to make it through it or not. So he slowly moved his kayak closer towards the entrance, looked into it, and figured, you know what, I think there's enough room. I'm pretty sure we could get through here. So he signaled Carly to follow him. She moved her kayak in behind his, and they started making their way into this second tunnel. When they were about halfway through, they noticed right in the middle of the tunnel, the roof came down. And at this point, they had no choice but to continue proceeding through it or try to paddle backwards against this current. So Brett in the lead, he slowly leaned back in his kayak. He put his hands up on the roof of the tunnel and very slowly, just kind of hand over hand, made his way across that low spot of the tunnel. After he cleared it, he kind of held on to a portion of the roof, turned around, and watched Carly do the same thing behind him. Once she cleared that low spot, they continued making their way through the tunnel. Once they got out of the tunnel and they were now in North Cross Lake, they immediately had to turn left and start heading west across this lake. Because right when you come out of this tunnel, if you go straight, you're going to bottom out, so you have no choice but to go left. There's actually markers. They're like steel pickets sticking up out of the water. So as soon as they came out, they turned left. They made their way around those markers and into this channel that flows into North Cross. Once out on North Cross, they made their way north towards Sailing Lake, which is the fourth lake in the system. As they made their way across the lake, they were talking and they decided that, you know what, they were pretty tired and they just did not have it in them that night to do a portage. See, to get into Sailing Lake, which is where they had planned to spend the first night, you have to portage around the small waterfall. It's about 10 feet high, but it drops almost straight down onto just super sharp rocks. So there's no way you could just go over this thing. You actually have to pick up your canoe or your boat or your kayak and portage that 200 yards around this waterfall. And at this point, they were so tired that they just did not have it in them to make that portage. So they decided that they were going to camp on North Cross Lake, but they were not going to camp close to where that portage is. They were actually going to camp a little bit to the east of that portage. There's a second waterfall there, so this small bay, and they decided that they would camp right at the top of that other waterfall. When they got closer towards that bay, they turned their kayaks and they made their way towards the top of that other waterfall. Once they got closer, they noticed this big rock that comes out into the water right at the top of the waterfall. So they moved their kayaks towards it, got out, pulled them up onto the rock, and then they set up camp. They ended up having a small campfire, they had some food, and they spent the rest of the evening sitting down by the water, listening to the sounds of that waterfall, listening to the sounds of nature. I just spent some time talking and enjoying each other's company. That night at about 10 o'clock, just being absolutely exhausted, they decided that was it. They were calling it a night. So they made their way up to the tent and they settled in for the night. However, at about 12:30 that morning, they were both abruptly woken up by the sound of all hell breaking loose not far from their tent in the woods. And it sounded like two animals were fighting. They could hear this real deep guttural growls and snarls and yips. They could hear trees breaking, branches breaking. They could hear the bushes rustling. And both of them were just instantly filled with just this absolute feeling of dread. And Brent, growing up hunting black bear, recognized a lot of those sounds as being from a black bear. So his first instinct was to protect Carly. So he grabbed his bear spray in one hand, grabbed his knife, and he got in between Carly and these sounds. Carly was behind him, just completely terrified, and neither one of them at this point even wanted to speak a word. They did not want to alert these bears fighting outside to their presence in the tent. This crazy fighting went on for about 5 minutes when all of a sudden they heard this loud snap, followed by a sound that Brent instantly identified and recognized as a black bear's death moan. And as soon as he heard that sound, his first thought was, okay, this definitely was two bears fighting. A larger bear just took out a smaller bear. And after a few minutes, that larger bear should just wander off and we should be fine. However, after about 2 minutes, they heard something incredibly large moving through the bush from where they had heard that death moan down to the water where they had been sitting earlier that evening. Now, not only terrified, Brent was also filled with just an absolute abundance of curiosity. He really wanted to see the size of this bear that had just taken out another bear. So he very slowly made his way towards the front of the tent, unzipped it just enough so he could peek out. And when he looked out down towards the water, he saw this massive black wolf leaning down into the water, drinking from the lake. At this point, he could feel Carly moving up behind him, and she just whispered in his ear, "What is it?" And he said, "It's a wolf." And in his head, he was thinking, this does not make sense. This wolf is absolutely massive. He describes this thing as just being like 3 times the size of a full-grown timber wolf. He said it was just absolutely huge. And in his head, he was like, there's no way a wolf could take out a bear, at least not a lone wolf. A pack of wolves, yes, but not a lone wolf. And he kind of moved backwards a little bit and ended up bumping into Carly, and she slid along the top of her sleeping bag, which made that little bit of a rustle sound that you get when you rub the top of a sleeping bag. It's kind of that nylon-y sound. And as soon as it made that sound, this wolf, leaning down into the water, instantly stood up on his hind legs at a height of about 7 feet, turned, looked directly towards the tent with these piercing amber eyes. He describes this wolf standing in front of him looking a lot like the stereotypical werewolf in Hollywood movies, very similar to what the werewolves look like in Dog Soldiers. Just a very tall bipedal wolf. Both of them are even more terrifying now because what they're looking at just should not exist in their minds. They stared directly at this thing for about 15 seconds while it stared directly back at them. After about 15 seconds, this thing let out just an absolute guttural, earth-shattering howl that they could feel resonate through their entire bodies. And then it turned and made its way back towards where they had heard that black bear's death moan. Both of them are in the tent, just afraid to breathe at this point. They know that this thing outside knows they're there, but they just did not want to make any sound to even alert this thing more. So both of them are just basically huddled together, listening to this thing make its way through the trees towards that bear. And for the next about 45 minutes to an hour, all they could hear was cracking and tearing, and they could hear this thing grunting and just making all types of just absolute horrifying sounds. After about 45 minutes to an hour, this thing again let out another one of those earth-shattering howls, and almost immediately that howl was answered by another one across that bay to the east. At this point, Brent was absolutely even more horrified. He could feel Carly grabbing around him, and he had no idea what to do. He did not know if they should just basically wait this out, stay as quiet as possible, and hope that these creatures just left them alone, or if they should risk it, try running for their kayaks, and try to get out of there as quick as possible. But he did not know how many of these things there were. He knew now that there's at least 2 of these things in the area, but he had no idea how fast they were. He didn't know if they could swim, and he didn't know if there was another one waiting just outside the tent, waiting for them to try making a run for it. So he basically just stayed completely frozen in fear with Carly wrapped around him. And after about 10 minutes, they could hear again something moving through the bush around the edge of that bay towards where that other one was. At this point, again, just absolutely terrified. Their hearts are racing. When all of a sudden, Carly starts hitting him on the back. So he turns and looks, and on the top of their tent, they had not put the rain fly on that night because it was a clear night and they wanted some better ventilation. He looks up, and all he sees are these two amber eyes looking down at them inside the tent. At this point, he felt like he was just going to pass out. He could feel Carly grabbing onto him and just squeezing. She's crying. He could feel himself just basically about to break down and just give up. When all of a sudden those eyes just turned and they could hear that creature moving further away from the tent. For the rest of the night, the two of them, they just held each other close, not knowing if they were even going to live to see the morning. Once dawn broke, they decided that they were going to make a break for their kayaks, and it had been a couple of hours of not hearing any sounds or any sign of these creatures, so they figured that they most likely had moved out of the area, and now was their chance to try to get out of there. So they moved towards the front of the tent, unzipped it just a little bit more, looked around, saw no sign of these things, so they unzipped the tent and beelined it directly for their kayaks. They pushed them out into the water, jumped in, and once out on the water, Brent turned and looked back towards where their camp had been, and about 25-30 yards from where their tent was set up, there's a small clearing in the bush, and he could see the remains of that black bear that this creature had been fighting, this dogman had been fighting. And you could see that majority of this bear looked like it had already been consumed. There was pieces of it kind of scattered all through the area. But what struck the most fear into him was the fact that this bear obviously had its neck broken by this dogman because its head was actually turned right around. And just knowing the sheer strength of this thing that he had just witnessed, that he had just been outside of his tent looking down at him and his wife, just sent absolute chills through his entire body. And they ended up making their way back towards Caddy. They completely abandoned all of their gear. There's no way that they were going back up onto shore to go get this. They ended up making their way all the way back to Caddy. They paddled as hard as they could the entire time. Once they got back there, they alerted conservation, made a report of this, and after a follow-up call with conservation a few weeks later, conservation told them that the officers that went out to investigate this did find remains of a black bear at the site, and that it was determined that this black bear had been killed and consumed by another black bear, and that they would keep their eyes open for any problemsome bears in the area. Now, Brett and Carly know that this was not a bear, and ever since this happened, the two of them have not done any more backwoods camping. They'll only go out to various parks to do kayaking during the day, and that is it. Well, that's it for today's encounter. What I find really interesting about this encounter is the fact that it took place in 2009, which is the exact same year as another story I've done here on the channel that took place out at Sailing Lake that happened to a guy named Greg. Now, I know this area very well. I used to spend a lot of time out on this river system, and where Greg experienced what he saw and where Brett and Carly experienced what they went through, it's only about a half a kilometer apart. So I find that incredibly interesting, especially considering it was probably about a month or two difference in time where these two events took place. But as always, let me know your thoughts on this. Please leave a comment down in the comments below. If you haven't done so already, if you're a return viewer or even a new viewer, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you next time.